In the first reading, we heard how it is that Elijah hands on to Elisha his ministry. And this is important because Elijah was a great prophet, but so was Elijah. Elijah was a great prophet, but so was Elisha. Elisha did even more than Elijah did, even though Elijah gets all the fame, right? Elisha is the one who really did even more. And in the gospel, Jesus sends out the 72, and Jesus here he chooses 12, right? But from those 12, he chooses 3. But then he also sends people out, he sends out 72, right, in imitation of Moses, and what Moses did to send people into the land. But in, it's too early in the morning, okay. But Jesus chooses these 3, these 12, these 72, but he sends them out in pairs. He sends them out by 2. And so the apostles always had people around him. Peter had people around him. Some of the other apostles did. Paul and Barnabas went out together a lot to do missionary work. And one of the ones who is mentioned so often in the New Testament, but yet people don't think about him so much, is St. Timothy, right? Paul wrote 2 letters to him, but he also went on missionary journeys with Paul. He was a companion of Paul. As a matter of fact, Paul wrote, 13 letters in the New Testament? 6 of them are co-authored by St. Timothy, and a couple of them by Silvanus, right? So Paul is on 6 of those letters. It's not just him writing. He's writing to, let's see, who was it? The first and second letter to the Thessalonians, the second letter to the Corinthians, the church in Corinth, the letter to the Philippians, Philemon, and Colossians. St. Timothy, if you will, co-authored or was there when Paul wrote it. And so there would be that discussion, right? Because that's how teachers discuss, right? Priests do this, but rabbis are even better, so they would have been even better, right? They get together and discuss everything and form the thoughts and form the ideas and then put it down in a letter. And so, we see in Paul's letters different styles, right? Paul has a particular style writing to it in different parts of his ministry or to different churches or to different people. And part of that is because he didn't author all those letters just by himself. He had some help in the thinking through, in the writing, and then sending to deliver. So St. Timothy was there for 6 of those letters, and he even carried 2 of them, was sent ahead with 2 of them to the cities where St. Paul was writing. One time because Paul was in prison, so he couldn't get out, so he sent the letter with St. Timothy. St. Timothy was a younger man, so he was younger than Paul, was a disciple of Paul, together with Titus, together with Silvanus and some others. But Timothy was a very trusted disciple of Paul. Paul called him my beloved son, right? And taught him the scriptures, but also was glad for St. Timothy's knowledge of the scriptures. That St. Timothy, even at a young age, knew the scriptures well and could teach them because he was instructed by his mother and his grandmother, who, of Jewish background, were believers. They were followers of Jesus Christ. So then Paul writes 2 letters to Timothy, and he writes them instructing him in his work as a bishop. He's historically known as the Bishop of Ephesus, which is up in Turkey today, right? Or Turkey, or however you say it now, if you've been following the news. So he's up in modern Turkey, in Ephesus, and he's the bishop up there. He has other early bishops. St. John the Apostle was also up there, right, with the Blessed Mother, taking care of her. But St. Timothy is up there, and he's well respected in Ephesus. Well, we think often of these great church fathers, and they are. St. Augustine, St. Jerome, St. Ambrose, St. Athanasius, right? All of these great early church fathers. St. Timothy is one of those. right? Just because we don't really have any of his writing doesn't mean he wasn't one of them. He was most certainly one of those church fathers, trusted by the apostles, recognized and respected by the other church leaders, and known to be a great enough teacher that he was placed in Ephesus. Ephesus was a very important city. The church there was very important. It was important for it to be strong, important for it to be well-formed and well-taught. And so Timothy was entrusted with that because of he was known to be faithful and loyal. So I think it's important as we celebrate St. Timothy today that we recognize really what a great patron we have in St. Timothy, and that we call upon him regularly, but that we also strive to imitate what he was known for. Because saints aren't generic, right? The holier somebody is, the more unique they are. It's sin that makes us all the same. Because we're so small, you can't tell the difference between one person or another. Holiness magnifies who God created you to be. So the holier people are, the more unique they are, the more different they are from one another, while still having their humanity and their holiness in common. And so the saints are all very unique. They're not all the same. And God has given particular gifts to particular saints for his church, and for the reason of ministering, as well as for their own salvation and the salvation of others. We hear this a lot, right? We hear, for instance, if you lose something, you pray to St. Anthony. That's right. Why? Because God in his infinite wisdom decided that St. Anthony should be good at finding things. Right? If you want to sell your house, who do you pray to? St. Joseph. That's right. Why? Because God in his infinite wisdom decided that St. Joseph should be good at selling homes, or at least be good about family dwellings and families going where they need to go. St. Joseph had to move his family around. And so saints are unique, and God gives gifts to particular saints so that God decides that there are particular saints who have his ear on something, right? We say God doesn't play favorites, and he doesn't. But God plays favorites in certain areas, right? You can't compare yourself to somebody because they're different. But St. Joseph is favored in particular ways. St. Anthony is favored in particular ways, but not the same ways. St. Paul is favored in particular ways that Peter is not. But Peter is favored in his own ways, right? So the saints, the holier they are, the more unique they become, and the greater their particular gifts or benefits are available and helpful to the church. When I was in the seminary, we had I was at St. Meinrad Seminary in southern Indiana, so it's a Benedictine monastery. Well, about 8 miles up the road in Ferdinand, Indiana, there's a big Benedictine convent of nuns. And the monastery, we would often have events where we'd invite the town people in, or we would have some big event, fundraising or whatever, or just gathering, or a feast day. And without fail, the monks, right, the ones who were in charge of the gathering, always called up this particular nun in Ferdinand and get her to pray for good weather. Like, really? Why do you do that? Because it works, right? For whatever reason, she has God's ear on the weather. And so God gives people different gifts so that we can learn to depend upon each other. Independence is not a virtue, right? It might be nice to be independent, but it's not a virtue. It doesn't make us any holier. It doesn't make us any better. It's not that we want to be dependent on everybody because we're helpless. That's not the point. It's that we want to be able to do what we can do, but we also need to know that by God's design, I can't do everything. And other people can do it way better than I can. And so I need other people's help. And God gives gifts so that we have to stretch out and learn, who can help me with this? Who can help me with that? Or who can I help with what God has given me? So the saints, the holier they are, the more unique, the more different they are, and the richer the church becomes. because when God makes us holy, he makes us humble, which means we're readier to help and we are readier to ask for help, because independence is not a virtue. It's not bad, but it's not a virtue. And so we call on St. Timothy because of his particular gifts: loyalty, knowledge of the scriptures, willingness to teach. He had his own particular health ailments. They weren't really serious, but they bothered him. They held him back once in a while. Nevertheless, he continued to minister. He continued to teach. And he lived to be an old man, but he was still martyred, which is something else that's important. We see that a lot in the early church, that many were martyred when they're younger, but many are martyred when they're older. Maybe you've heard me say it before. It's true. There's no such thing in Christianity. There's no such thing as over the hill. No such thing as over. It's uphill all the way until the day the Lord calls us home. Uphill all the way, because holiness is an uphill climb, and we need God's strength to make it up the hill, to be sure, but it's an uphill climb. There's never a period where we say, okay, I'm old enough now, I'm wise enough now, I've done enough now, I can just glide through the rest of my life. That is not a Christian idea, right? And so St. Timothy, who when he became old, was still able to offer his life as a martyr, not because he necessarily wanted to be a martyr, but because his fidelity to the gospel, his fidelity to how he had been formed, his fidelity to sharing the gifts that God had given him and responding to the call that St. Paul put on him from God, brought him to the point where he received the martyr's crown, even in his old age. So if you're feeling like, I can't do what I used to, but you have other gifts, right? Don't slow down. Well, maybe you slow down. But don't, right? Don't give up. Don't think that somehow you're less useful to the gospel than you used to be, or somehow less important to the church than you used to be. No such thing is true, right? The dignity of each and every human person, all the way up until the day the Lord calls us home, is a gospel truth. We see examples of it again and again in the church. The effect that those God has chosen, even in their old age, to bring about great stability and great movement in the church by their wisdom, by their teaching, by their prayers, and by their example. And so today we look to St. Timothy, and we call upon him. St. Timothy, pray for us.